Maisie had not intended to go back, but as soon as the first year ended, her rich university friends took off for family-funded adventures abroad or headed deep into the English countryside. Maisie wanted to fly off somewhere glamorous, but as usual her bank account was empty. She sighed and took the train back to her hometown of Brighton. Someone told her about a sublet, a room in a house up by the Duke of York cinema. The owners were away for the summer. It looked nice in that funky, Brighton, slightly hippie but a bit chic way. She left most of her stuff locked up in storage, back at university halls of residence. You didn't need much in Brighton during the warmer months. A few faded print dresses, vintage leather jackets, and a pair of Dr. Martens. That would do. Then she walked down to the seafront and asked for her old waitress job back at the Fitz. After a double shift on Friday, followed by a manic Saturday night during which she barely caught her breath, it was as if she'd never been away. On Sunday, before the doors opened, there were the same lilting voices of the art students from Liverpool, Manchester, and Yorkshire, drifting across the wooden tables and mismatched chairs as they all sat eating a fry-up before retreating to the kitchen to prep for brunch. Only the waitresses changed each season, all except Maisie, who had started there when she was 17 and, with her recent return, now felt as if she had never left. Slipping back into the old routine, she cleared another table and looked out at the July rain. It was the depressingly usual kind of British summer, a day or so of bright sunshine during which the British tourists flocked to the beaches and got horribly sunburned, followed by days of rain when the pebbles were so waterlogged the seagulls picked their way gently over them to find tidbits to eat. Maisie slowly and methodically wiped down the wooden tables and set up the funky cutlery and mismatched glassware. The chefs were busy downstairs. She could hear their loud music coming through the walls. The other two waitresses, Joan and Sue, were gossiping in the back by the coffee pots over Joan's new conquest, Darren, the sous chef. Occasionally they looked over at Maisie and then exchanged smirks. Maisie knew what they thought. She was young, naive, and not attuned to salacious gossip about boys and other distractions. And they were right, but she didn't care. The Fitz was hardly an upscale restaurant. It was a place you sunk into gratefully to escape the rain or to while away the afternoon with one cup of coffee during a quiet afternoon writing a sad pop ballad. The cafe was named after Mrs. Fitzherbert, the mistress of the Prince Regent, who later became George IV. There had been a cafe called Fitz on the premises since between the wars. The menu was risk-averse, to say the least. They served reasonable, dubiously English-style meals, or one of the slightly risque-named hamburgers, the magic mushroom burger. The only magic was a lethal garlic mayonnaise. Maisie had watched Darren make it fresh once a week. Or the Saturday night burger. Maisie didn't know why it was called that, the pineapple on melted cheddar, an extra special only once a week treat, or was there something suggestive? That was Darren's theory. When the boarding school boys came in with their local girl dates and ordered the burgers by name, the blood rushed up the back of their necks. The sassy Brighton girls sucked on a cherry on the top of their ice cream sundae swizzle sticks, knowing full well what the boarding school boys wanted. They might get it. They might not. Usually not. And why should they put out? The Brighton girls were street smart. They knew the posh boys didn't see them as anything more than a bit of skirt, definitely not girlfriend material. It was an exchange. The girls got treated to dinner before some inept fumblings. The boys got a contact high with a class they'd probably never mix with again. The brothers who owned the Fitz had to leave England for tax reasons, and they installed a proper restaurant manager to handle things back home. His name was Mike, a thin man who dressed in ill-fitting grey suits, losing the jacket to help out during Saturdays in his shirt sleeves. One night, Mike suddenly appeared before the evening shift, wearing tight jeans and a black leather bomber jacket. Maisie served him the staff meal downstairs by the kitchen. He said he was on his way to hear the Clash play in one of the clubs under the arches by the beach. It seemed so unlikely. But she knew Mike had another side. Everyone at Fitz had another side. except her. One Wednesday, on a particularly gloomy day, when few tourists had ventured out to eat, Mike told Maisie to clock off at 4 and gave her the lion's share of the tips, as she'd done most of the work. This didn't endear her to Joan and Sue, who both grabbed bottles of red wine when Mike wasn't looking and left by the back door. Maisie saw them but didn't say anything. Instead, she headed for her locker downstairs by the kitchen, but when she opened the door to grab her leather jacket, she nearly smashed into Darren, who was bringing beers up from the basement. She saw the beer crate about to hit the floor and grabbed it. He looked surprised that she could lift it. Then he gave her a half smile and handed her a beer, leaning back against the wall to see if she'd take it. She did, but wouldn't meet his intense gaze. "I didn't think you'd come back," he said, continuing to look directly at her in that art student way of his, as if appraising her face for the way the light fell before he drew her. "Not once you've been to London." He said London as if it didn't impress him at all. The inverted snobbery was not lost on Maisie. The way the art students left Liverpool and Manchester and elsewhere to come to the art school in Brighton, bypassing London entirely, and yet, if they had any hope of a commercial career in the arts, the very city they would have to settle in eventually. She wanted to answer Darren in a way that would make him realize she had been changed by university. His opinion set the tone at Fitz. She needed to make sure this summer got off on the right foot. While she was still thinking of an answer, the kitchen bell rang and Darren got up, handed her another beer from the ice bucket on the steps, and disappeared through the double swing doors. Maisie put the cool beer against her cheek but didn't open it. Instead, she put it in her bag and walked down to the beach to see if the rain had stopped. She felt lonely. None of her friends from university had contacted her during their summer break. She'd left messages with various parents and/or answering services, but no one called back. Maisie was beginning to realize that she was only part of that scene during term time. And it looked like this was her reality for the moment. She had to make the best of it. Walking slowly back to her room in the rented house, she wondered what the rest of summer might be like. It occurred to her it might be exactly the same as every other summer working at the Fitz. Despite dreaming of adventures, it would be one long shift, followed by another until she'd paid off her debts from last term and had enough money to return to London. Depressed at the thought of yet another wasted summer, she stopped off at the art house cinema next door and ate popcorn for supper like the old days. After their shifts ended on Saturday, Maisie got her stuff together and overheard Joan asking Darren if he wanted to go clubbing. "Yeah, why not?" he said, then jerked his head at Maisie. "Do you ask her?" Joan didn't look best pleased with this, but she could tell that Darren wasn't just being nice. Joan gritted her teeth and said as brightly as she could, "Want to come?" Maisie did rather, because she hadn't planned anything else. "I can get us into the Zoo," said Darren. "My mate's sister Connie is DJing." "Constance Stallard?" said Maisie, surprised. Darren raised an eyebrow. Maisie pretended she was looking for something in her bag. "Yeah, Pete's sister," nodded Darren, putting his arm around Joan, who was seriously miffed by now. He gave Joan a squeeze and let his hand run up and down her back. Joan gave a squeal that was probably louder than she'd realized. Darren frowned and looked over again at Maisie. "You on the list too, then?" he said. "Probably not," said Maisie, following them both up the stairs, averting her eyes as Darren had his hand on Joan's bottom. "I haven't seen her since we left school." As Darren and Joan walked ahead, Maisie wished she had enough self-esteem to make her own plans. But she continued to tag along, ready to turn up Station Road if it looked like she was killing their vibe, or she'd just chickened out before seeing Constance again. At the club, the corrugated iron door was ajar, and Maisie could hear a track of music blending into another as a line of melody clashed with dark drum beats, and then, finally, silence, and then the first strains of King Curtis's rendition of A Whiter Shade of Pale. It was still early. Before the club had really got into gear, most people were drinking in the bar next door and the dance floor was empty. By 1 a.m. it would be heaving, but that was hours off. Her childhood friend Constance, dressed in boys' jeans and a stringy tank top, waved from the DJ booth. Maisie waved back. She watched Constance for a while and tried to see if she had changed at all since last summer, when they all celebrated the end of school and the beginning of what was next. Finally, Constance wrapped up her mix session in the booth and came down to look at Maisie, who, like Constance, had changed radically in the course of a year. Constance took in the black bob that replaced the long blonde hair, the thin layer of black liquid eyeliner on her eyelids, and the distinct dark circles underneath, and then smirked. Constance took the points of Maisie's new black bob and pulled them towards her cheekbones. "Very Louise Brooks," she said. Maisie grinned, but felt really foolish. Of course, it was exactly why she'd had a black bob cut in the first place, but it was embarrassing to have someone know that about you. Well before closing time, she slipped out the side door. Darren and the others had ignored her all night, so she didn't say goodbye. They'd see each other in a few hours anyway. She made her way up the hill past the railway station, and once inside the front door, she paused. It was a strange house, to her. No clutter or eccentricities or junk flowing down the stairs. There was even a coat stand by the door and a little shelf where you could hang your keys. Maisie still thought that was so grown up, so strange, but she carefully hung up the still unfamiliar keyring and checked her appearance in the hall mirror. Then she went upstairs and crawled into bed and tried to fall asleep, but she was hungry. She lay staring at the ceiling for ages and then looked at the bedside alarm clock. It was 3 a.m. She padded downstairs and looked in the cupboards to see if they had any biscuits. She found a packet of Ovaltine cookies that she knew she could replace at the corner shop and warmed up some milk in a saucepan on the top of the stove. Constance had asked her if she wanted to crash at their place, even though that would have come with all sorts of complications. Maisie now wished she'd said yes. Then she took the milk and cookies up to her room, knowing she had a sleepless few hours ahead until going back to the Fitz for the breakfast shift. The next week, Constance moved to Glasgow to DJ and didn't leave a forwarding number. Maisie only found out when someone else was in the DJ booth that night. After her shift, she went round to Constance's bedsit and found Jolyon, Constance's boyfriend, reading the paper. When did she leave? He just shrugged. He couldn't quite remember. They talked for a while. Jolyon didn't appear to be upset, but then she couldn't remember Jolyon ever actually having any sort of emotion for as long as she'd known him. "I'm moving to London." "London?" "Yes, it's the capital city of the UK. I'm familiar with that fact. The question is why, Jolyon?" "I've got a job. My brother lives in Blackheath," he continued. Maisie had met Jolyon's brother. He'd been at school with them. He was a flight instructor at the National Theatre who lived with a crowd of dancers and actors in the top 2 floors of a massively run-down Edwardian townhouse in Blackheath. Apparently they passed through each other's bedrooms and lives under the watchful gaze of the mural of Salvador Dali painted on the kitchen wall, his moustache flicked over the peeling paint on the window frames. "You could come and visit me sometime," said Jolyon, leaning back on the kitchen wall, taking a last look at the place. Maisie stood up and looked around. She knew she'd never see this bedsit again. An era had ended. But they both knew she'd never visit him in London. As she walked out into the rain-soaked street, she realized she was now late for work. She pulled her jacket close about her body and ran for the bus. The next day at the Fitz was meant to be her last before she returned to university at the end of the summer. She didn't tell anyone, but Mike, the manager, had quietly let the others know. After the shift ended, Darren cut the lights while Joan carried out a huge pink frosted cake. Maisie was stunned. "Blow," said Mike a bit over-enthusiastically, as everyone else snorted. Maisie blew out the candles and everyone clapped and then rushed to grab cheap house wine from the back table. She looked around, confused. Everyone was being nice to her now she was leaving. Maisie suddenly understood that she was completely replaceable. That some other young girl would show up asking for a job once she'd left. They would slip into her place, just as she'd slipped into whoever preceded her. Mike was signaling it was time to lock up. Everyone quickly stashed what was left of cake and wine in the kitchen, leaving the busboys to finish up. Darren was already halfway out the door, his arm around Joan, when he looked back. Maisie was about to wave and smile, but she decided against it. "See you next time you're back in Brighton," he said. "Oh, I'm not coming back," she replied. "We're not good enough for you anymore?" Maisie knew she had to say something. If she didn't, she'd be doomed to repeat this experience. She'd go back to university for the Michaelmas term and then find herself back here yet again next summer. She decided to be bold. "Darren, why are you still here? You graduated from art school 3 years ago. When I first met you, you told me you were going to be the next Andy Warhol." Darren looked as if she'd reached in and twisted his heart into knots. "You're really talented," Maisie continued, feeling stronger and stronger. "I've seen your graduation show work in Mike's flat. Your paintings are amazing." They both knew Mike had only bought the canvases because Darren was about to get evicted, but Maisie could see Darren had talent. Mike just took her word for it that they were an investment and bought them. "It's just, you know," he said finally, and she did. For the first time since she'd worked at the Fitz, Maisie didn't feel like the youngest or the most naive person working there. She had learned something this summer. She wasn't sure exactly what it was, but she knew she wasn't going to stick around here when there were other places to go. This couldn't be her go-to summer experience anymore. Maisie walked back to the house she'd been renting and made sure all the appliances were turned off. Then she made the bed, stuffed her clothes into her duffel bag, and put the keys through the letterbox as she left. "Hi," said a voice behind her at the train station. It was Constance. "What are you doing here?" said Maisie. "I couldn't hack it in Glasgow. I missed Brighton." Maisie could feel the pull of her life, very recently uprooted, wanting to take hold again. She resisted. "Oh, well, I'm heading back to university on the next train." "Can't you stay?" said Constance, who looked really tired and wrung out. "Just for a few days." "What happened in Scotland with your job?" Maisie was buying time and she knew it. Constance looked around the station. She didn't answer. Maisie realized she was expecting Jolyon to be here. "Constance, did you know Jolyon's in London now?" "No. Since when?" "He got a job and moved in with Ben, in Blackheath." "Shit, he never told me." Constance seemed at a loss. She looked at Maisie's bag. "Is that all you have?" "Yes, I left the rest of the stuff in storage at university." "So you're really going back?" Maisie realized that Constance thought she'd come back to Brighton and was going to stay, like everyone else they knew. "I'm glad I caught you," said a voice behind her. It was Darren. Constance looked between the two of them. "Didn't know you two had a summer fling," she said, not hiding her disappointment at Maisie's choices. "We didn't," Maisie and Darren said at the same time. Then Constance noticed Darren had his artist easel and oil paints in a case with a backpack slung over his shoulder. "Are you leaving too?" said Constance. "Yeah," said Darren, nodding at Maisie. She gave me a wake-up call. "What are you going to do?" asked Maisie, impressed. "I'm going to stay with a mate in Blackheath and paint his crazy housemates until Christmas. Then look for a job in a gallery or something art-related while I save up enough cash to get a studio." "I didn't know you knew Ben," said Constance. Maisie had no idea that Darren knew Ben, Jolyon's brother, but it was a small world after all. "Do you want to sit together?" said Darren. "Sure," said Maisie. "Wait for me, over by the platform," said Constance, suddenly running across the station to buy a ticket for the 5:13 too. As the train pulled out, Darren, Maisie and Constance were swapping notes about their last summer in Brighton, not knowing for once what tomorrow would bring, but knowing it couldn't possibly be anything like yesterday, or the day before that, or the day before that. It would be something else.